We're really excited to present this group of people to you today to discuss what we're seeing in the field of AI investment and development, especially as security practitioners, where we are seeing quick wins and where we are seeing foundational steps being laid for the long term. And just as importantly, what do we want to see come out of it? As a brief intro of who we are and what we are here to do, I'll call on the panelists to give a intro, and I will start with Dr. Stuart Evans.
Thank you, Julie. My name is Stuart Evans. I'm just retired as a distinguished professor at Carnegie Mellon, and now I'm a senior fellow in the Biometrics Institute in the ECE department in Pittsburgh. I've been at CMU for 18 years, and during that time, I ran an innovation lab with Emirates Airlines, working with their CIO and all their people in the infrastructure there. So I'm delighted to be here. Thank you very much for inviting me.
Thank you so much for joining us. I'll also put in a plug that Stuart has written a book not so long ago on super flexibility in organizations, as well as doing a lot of research on organizations to prove out those facts.
Thank you, Julie. I appreciate that. I think adaptation is the key that we'll be talking about some more during our call today.
Indeed, indeed. Next, Carolyn Wong.
I'm going to have to get myself a copy of that book by Stuart as well, so I'm delighted to hear about it. My name's Caroline Wong. I've been a cybersecurity practitioner for the last couple of decades, primarily working at technology companies, both on sort of the security practitioner side as well as the cybersecurity solution vendor side. I'm the author of a book that is going to come out in March of 2026 called the AI Cybersecurity Handbook.
Awesome. I am so pleased to have not just one, but two published authors on our panel as well. It definitely is telling us all to step up our game, I think. Next, I'd like to ask David Elston, who works with a really hot up-and-coming startup called Spacewalk.ai.
Yeah, thank you, Julie. I'm David Elston. I'm CTO and co-founder of Spacewalk AI. I'm a software engineer with about 15 years experience. I worked in the government space for 7 or 8 years, and then I was at another startup called Obsidian Security, but I've been at Spacewalk for around a year, generally focused on building an AI platform for cybersecurity incident response, but delighted to be here.
Excellent. Thank you so much for joining us, David. Definitely there's a lot of really important insights I think we can pull out from both the practitioner and the research space, and also from people who've worked in government before too. So
Sure.
last but not least, Ian, who works with one of our companies, Gambak. Would you go ahead, Ian?
Yeah, of course. Thanks, Julie. Ian Amit, I'm the co-founder and CEO at Gambak AI. We are a cloud infrastructure remediation company. We deliver accurate, deterministic fixes to cloud infrastructure. In my past, I've worked in cybersecurity for over 25 years. My last few roles have been as a chief security officer in large public companies. And I don't have a book, but my only claim to fame is being quoted in congressional hearings on some cybersecurity research. So
that's
I'll
pretty
take
good.
that.
You're on the record now, you know.
Oh yeah, of course. It's always.
Yeah, and I think that one of the things that we CISOs and vendors like to playfully tease each other about is going to the dark side, but it's not really clear which one is really the dark side on some level, right?
It's all
So
dark everywhere. It's
I know exactly. I think that you have to develop a very quirky sense of humor in this business, and I think most of us do. A very short amount about me. I recently joined Ballistic as CISO in residence and really thrilled to join the brilliant practitioners and investors with Ballistic. I've also been running events with AI Insiders and Polaris Collective, which I founded with some friends, and most recently was CISO over at Roblox as we came up through COVID and direct offering. So let's get into the good stuff here today. First of all, we're seeing in both company space as well as an investor space a lot of almost euphoria about the idea of what AI can provide in terms of productivity gains and efficiency and leveling whole fields of jobs and industries. And for workers, I think that's a definitely more than a double-edged sword with one side that's sharper than the other, in terms of what that means. What are some of our thoughts about what productivity gains truly can be there, or what we're going to see, let's say, in the next year or two versus what we think we're going to see in maybe 5 to 10 years?
The timing is good. I've just done a program at Berkeley on AI in the C-suite, and we were very fortunate to have Ali, the CEO of Databricks, join us. And as an example, I think, of just how productivity improvements are being achieved right now, he was talking about the integrations that they have to do to get the data into the lakehouse. And they have a team of like 10 people that would take 12 months to do a single integration. They turned to rethink that and used AI. They've just done 7 integrations in 3 months. And I think we've seen that across the board on regulation and things like that, filings that need to be done, regulatory filings that need to be done. I think it's just gathering data and doing things like that. I think that the big problem is that productivity gains are really hard to monetize and figure out what the ROI is. And I think we've kind of moved into a different sort of space now where the real impact is on reimagining a business as an AI first business and working backwards from that rather than simply automating what we do already. And I think that's the big mindset shift that I'm seeing coming about right now.
I think that mindset shift you mentioned in terms of reimagining your space gives more room for truly transformative change. But to double click on what you just said about productivity gains being hard to monetize, why doesn't that show up in people's cost bottom lines in terms of either being able to do more or hit their profit margins?
Yeah, sure. I think that in the example that I just used, the real change was just the cost of doing the software. That's the thing that shifted. But when you look at all the activities involved, the actual coding part of coming up with an integration, for example, isn't the whole game. And so you can't really lose, 20% of somebody. They're still got to be there to do the other things. And my students, for example, are really having a hard time getting jobs as software engineers now. And I think people have to adapt to that. But I do think that there's a mindset now where for every earnings call, a company has got to lay out its AI strategy in serious kind of detail about who's doing what and who they're working with and what their anticipated ROI is going to be. And I think that's putting a lot of pressure on legacy companies to really do something pretty different. And it's a different kind of it's not a technology upgrade we're dealing with here. This is a very different way of running a business.
That's an interesting point to put there. Before we go down that thread, does anyone on this panel agree or disagree with what Stuart had said in terms of productivity gains?
I think that there are individuals who are learning to use AI, and it's amazing. One individual human who might have spent 8 or 10 hours to do some piece of work, if they're able to do it in 2 hours, that individual is seeing the benefits. Their organization might be seeing some side benefits, but that's really what I'm seeing right now. The other thing that I'm seeing that I think is distinct from a couple of years ago is that today, I notice that every tech company calls itself an AI company.
Yes.
And then there are some companies, and you say, well, how does that work exactly? And you won't get a straight answer. And then there's organizations who they've actually been doing AI and machine learning for more than a decade.
Right.
And those
For real.
individuals are really shining. I think there's such an interesting difference between an engineering team who has configured an internal instance of ChatGPT and the engineering team that built ChatGPT.
Right.
Like those are different things.
Yeah,
and
that's
it's
right.
and to me today in 2025, you can tell the difference. Last year, maybe a little bit less so.
And to kind of piggyback on both Stuart and Caroline, the way I see it is in 3 tiers. So the first tier is what Caroline was talking about, an individual utilizing AI technologies and models to get better productivity, to shorten the time from 8 hours to 2 hours, to shorten the time from 2 hours to 15 minutes. These are typically productivity tasks around either automation or consumption of data. The ability of LLMs and machine learning to kind of summarize things, that's on the personal side. The second tier is on the team or process side. And that's where it gets a little tricky because now you're talking about a business. Now you're talking about integrations. Now you're talking about taking data from point A through team B and doing something with it in the context of a business process. I think that's where a lot of AI initiatives fail, because there's some magical expectation for a unicorn AI company to come in, drop in whatever they're doing, and magically things are happening. And that's just not the case. If it's not very well scoped and broken down to almost the individual tasks that Caroline was talking about, it is just going to fail. And the third part is what Stuart was talking about, the complete transformation or reimagining, not based on the existing processes and the way that companies are working, but reimagining a whole new way and kind of working backwards from an assumption that we have AI, it has, and again, this is where a lot of companies I see at least fail, even when they try to do that, is recognizing what technologies work for which problems. And again, the problem right now is that a lot of vendors are just promising the moon to everyone, and people go like, all right, yeah, as a business, we'll start with the moon and work backwards. And again, things break down because they're trying to apply the wrong models to the wrong problems, and they're not really defining what are we trying to do. So in short, again, sorry about belaboring this, but I think that what we're seeing is only the first tier, is only what Caroline was talking about. And I'm sure that we're all experiencing that on our day-to-day in terms of all the AI agents and capabilities that we have. But the business side, whether it's reverse engineering from the goal or trying to augment existing processes, are still stuck in the hype cycle that so many vendors are pushing. And that cycle, that bubble is in the process, again, not to be the naysayer, but it's in the process of kind of exploding to smaller bubbles that are much more digestible and we can work with.
Yeah, after a certain amount of time, we look for certain patterns. I like that saying that history doesn't repeat itself, but it does rhyme. And so this idea of things coming back. David, you work at what I would characterize as a native AI first company. In terms of what you all are seeing with working with potential customers, does the value that they're getting out of your product or AI lie more in spoon feeding them something that is a consumable product of AI, or helping them to use AI?
I think it can depend, echoing some of the panel's points on the maturity of the team. I think some teams that are very mature, they're looking for the product of AI. They are looking to yield efficiency gains on their reporting process or their communication process, or how they should structure incident response. I think for less mature teams, they know they have a problem. They know AI can help, but they don't know how to put those two things together. And I think to echo some of the panel's points, I think it's certainly in engineering, I would push that into a security space as well. Fairly evident that AI leads to productivity gains. Software engineers can write more code, can do more PR, can learn faster, can use more technologies. But if those productivity gains are in a structure that was based on a non-AI pattern, you start to hit internal barriers where you don't have enough people to review the code, or there's not enough people to security vet the code that's coming through, or your infrastructure can no longer keep up with the volume of updates that are coming in. So I think, I read this morning that YouTube were looking at a big restructuring of potentially their entire organization to be flatter, to better leverage AI gains. So I do think we're in this space where we're starting to understand AI as a technology. I think to Caroline's point, I think there is a difference between companies who are building foundational models or building that foundational technologies, and then companies that are building, what I kind of term AI product, using that technology to exploit and solve a problem. And I think we're seeing the first generation of those companies struggle a little bit. Some have made it through. There's the superhumans, the curses of this world. But
Right.
I think the second generation is really starting to push through now.
Yeah, and I think there's going to be a lot of really interesting, more native AI kind of insights from that. Along the lines of what you all have mentioned, there was a very interesting study that I think some of us have looked at from the METR, which talked about the productivity gains studying patterns of open source developers. And they, looking at a certain defined set of patterns, what they discovered was that middle swath of developers, like not the inexperienced ones and not the experts, and maybe about like 90% of that stretch actually saw a decrease in productivity, pretty substantial. And the only ones that were showing increase in productivity, at least in this, this time of study, were the completely new folks or the people who were completely expert, experienced, knew what they were looking for. Now, I think it will be very interesting to run a similar study on them or similar cohort in 3 years and 5 years and see if, we're seeing the same things. But at least initially, it looks like, that set won't necessarily, there's a learning curve. What's equally interesting was that they all had the perception that their productivity was way up. And so some of the self-reporting and the narratives inside companies, I think, would be about that excitement of what we're doing great, we're getting so much more done. But the reality, I think, to Stuart's point about measuring productivity and getting that fed into actionable insights, is much harder to pin down. So we're seeing organizations flex and change in anticipation or trying to be ahead of that curve, like YouTube, as you mentioned. What do you all think of whether or not that is prescient, looking ahead, or is that premature at this point?
There's this real interesting question of, can you describe the use case? And I think that's on the part of, like, when Ian talks about kind of, I'm a human, I use AI, I can do what used to take me 8 hours in 2 hours. But then you try and do that with a team and a business process and with integrations. The question is, what's the business process use case for AI? And if that's not well defined, and if to date it's just sort of been done by people, then there's going to need to be a lot of specification that occurs before something miraculous is going to happen. And I also wonder to what extent there is sort of an upper management level which is being yelled at by executives and by the board to get AI into everything, make stuff better, where are the productivity gains, show me the money. And then the poor folks who are kind of doing these
Right.
things being handed various, oh, my vendor that used to do that now claims they have AI, let's try it out. Oh, it's not very
Yes.
good, and then it's sort of not helpful, right? And the boss is saying to them, give me your AI wins, and they're like, well, we're kind of working on that.
We
We
will
get there.
Yeah, I love how you phrase that. What's the business process use case? Can you define that? Stuart?
Yeah, I mean, I agree with everything Caroline said. I think that there's kind of an existential problem, I think, in most organizations, and that they've been configured really for process rather than outcome. And I think now it's systems of action that we need to get to rather than systems of record and things like that. And I think in general, most CIOs are expected to be able to jump into AI and kind of get stuff done. And it's kind of weird. I mean, I'm hearing from some people that they get, the CFO turns around and says, look, you got a 20% productivity gain, so we're going to reduce your budget by 20%. And, that just kind of isn't the right way to look at this thing. The organizational structure that seems to work right now is like an overlay on top of this kind of matrixed organization of the past, which doesn't really work very well. But to sort of patch things, what I'm seeing is that people are putting like tiger teams together that they drop into a business problem because you can't really overlay it on the existing way of doing things. And in the past, we valued specialists in different areas, and I think
Yeah.
the name of the game now is integration. And I don't think we've got the right organizational architectures to really think about how to do that. And it needs to be explored and played with. It's not something that can be prescribed ahead of time, and it's different for every different company, the way that they've evolved. So I think that every board and C-suite now is realizing that this is a paradigm shift, and the experiments that they've been playing with in the past is sort of not necessarily the right way to go about doing it. And what I'm seeing right now is that a lot of companies are putting orchestration layers in, not knowing which direction
Right.
they're going to move in.
Ah,
They're also confronted with this problem that the innovation cycle is quicker than the deployment cycle. So a
right.
lot of people like Avi at KLA, you do, even if you know what you're doing, you do stuff, and then you find 90 days down that what you're doing is kind of obsolete because something else has come out. So I think, we need to shift the way our organizational mindset works from this. Instead of like a building, it's going to be like a whitewater raft where you're moving around, you don't know what rocks around the corner, and you've got to adapt on the fly. And that really flies against the much of the MBA curriculums that our leaders have been taught. So
Absolutely.
it's a new world.
That's a really interesting observation, Stuart, on a number of levels. The thing that's really jumping out at me is that, well, most places are doing tiger teams. And when I think back to in any organization of any size, if we had something unusual and new to do, it was almost always the smartest move to put together some sort of tiger team quickly with the people that you knew who could execute on XYZ and just break down barriers. Looking at that, that sounds like the kind of environment and the kind of mission that should advantage startups over enterprises. And I'm going to pose this question next to Ian and David about this. Like, what do you think? Do you think the current landscape is going to advantage startups more in terms of organizational nimbleness and being able to try out those things, or the deep pockets of those big organizations that can withstand turbulent times?
Yeah, I can take that. And again, I'd like to mention a couple of things that you and Stuart said, specifically around, and to answer your question, I don't think there's a difference. Startups has the nimbleness of being able to move fast. Big organizations have the deep pockets. I don't think that will be the difference. What strikes me as the real difference is what you've mentioned before about the METR study. And the difference is those 5%. The experts are very well educated. They know exactly how to use the right models for what they're trying to achieve. Again, going back to Stuart about the outcome, not the process.
Yeah.
The super beginners have no idea what they're doing. They have knowledge gaps. And AI or LLMs can be really good in kind of filling knowledge gaps. Most of the people, the 90%, are somewhere in the middle. They're just not educated enough to understand what's the difference between models. And let me, hopefully this is not new to anyone here. There is no such thing as an AI product. There's no AI. AI is a big practice. It's been around for decades. It didn't start in the past 5 or 6 years with generative AI and LLMs, but nowadays, when I'm talking to executives, when I'm talking to businesses, when they say AI, I ask them specifically, what are you talking about? And they say, oh, it's that ChatGPT, generative, Gemini,
Right.
whatever. And the problem goes back to whether it's a startup or a big organization. If you're trying to only use the hype of that LLM, that generative AI to solve every problem, you are going to fail miserably. And that's exactly where those 90% of the participants in the study failed, because they were expecting to get something from an LLM that it is not designed to deliver. If you're trying to help, write something or summarize something, yes, you need that creativity. It is designed, again, by definition, to hallucinate. One of my good friends, Bob Cook, who's a professor and a senior principal, extra VP at AWS. He heads the automated reasoning group. He wrote an article recently about, again, explaining to people these things are designed to hallucinate. So do not expect them to be deterministic. Right. And you're facing an engineering problem, going back to Stuart's point about the results or the outcomes. Do not expect a deterministic outcome from a non-deterministic model. And to your point, Julie, whether you're a startup or a big company, first and foremost, educate yourself. What is the outcome and what are the right models to operate to get to that outcome? What is the problem domain? I think once we get to that level of education within the businesses, within the practitioners, then we'll see that spike. Then we'll see that the cash the checks being cashed on all those promises that AI has underwritten in the past few years.
Yeah, that's right. David, what are your thoughts about the smaller organization versus the large organization, since you've gotten experience at both to an extreme right now?
Yeah, I think I mean, fundamentally, LLMs as tweeting points. It's this new disruptive force in the entire world, and fundamentally, it's going to disrupt, I imagine, every aspect of our lives at some point in time in the future. So if you are in a company that thrives on disruption, that thrives on innovation, can reshape itself, can re-architect itself to deal with that. Startups, by their very nature, are designed to be disruptive. I do think you have startups where their entire mode of attack has disappeared because of the LLM wave that we're in. And again, it's can they change, can they adapt, can they innovate with this new disruptive force? I spent 6 or 7 years working for the government, and the government does a very good job with innovation, but at the same time struggles to deal with it at the same time. And I think you will see large organizations who are slow to make change, are slow to adapt, will struggle, and they'll find kind of disruption seeping through their workforce. But the larger companies like YouTube or Amazon, where they already are shifting and they already are re-architecting their entire business around AI, I don't think they'll struggle. But I do think startups, it's definitely created a very good level playing field for startups, that's for sure.
Yeah, one of the things I think larger companies have to leverage to their advantage to get anywhere close to startup pace is being able to have a strong, swift authority from the top. And this, in the more lasting large organizations I've seen, like what they were able to do was use a sort of fast twitch muscle when they needed to, and just issue directives from the top, and they would just sweep through, and that was that. There's the pros and cons of it, of course, but that was sort of one of it. Pivoting a little bit on something that Stuart, that you had mentioned earlier about we're moving from systems of record to systems of action, which I love. This idea of these different autonomous agents in a diverse and dirty, heterogeneous ecosystem interacting. And what are they doing? We don't know. Hygiene is kind of a passing thought, right? Many people right now, with the rise of the importance of LLMs and ChatGPT and all the different models, have said that, hey, data is taking a resurgence now. Data security is more important. I think that there's a big healthy dose of truth in that. But what you had said makes me wonder if there will be more of an emphasis now on workflow and process around it rather than data. What are your thoughts on that?
Let me think about it, because I wanted to also address the really good point you made about decisive leadership. I think that's really absolutely essential. And one of the things that I see as being a problem in very large organizations is you have, chief marketing officer, chief data officer, chief security officer, chief information officer, chief technology officer. And that kind of fragments. I mean, in one sense, you might have a lot more broader experimentation, but I don't think companies have the luxury of doing that for their innovation process when they're putting it into practice. So I think there needs to be that kind of alignment. And it's like the analogy we used earlier on about whitewater rafting. Everybody's got to work together to do things in the moment. And so going back to your question about data, I think The data question is super interesting. I mean, who owns the risk of the data? Is it the model provider? Is it the company? Is it the individual that's using it? How
Yes.
how do you do that? And how do you secure data at work? I mean, you can't really get in to see what's going on to be able to do things with it in the way that we traditionally done things in repositories. So I think that there's a need to rethink the way these big organizations adapt, because I think the existential threat is that somebody's going to come along and reinvent the business from scratch,
Yes.
AI native,
Native first.
that's going
Right.
to have tiny teams running them and a massive cost advantage and efficiency advantage. And I think, while we talk about the bubble of these, overpriced investments that have been made that seem to be outrageous, I think the bigger bubble that we need to really worry about is some of these traditional companies that aren't moving quick enough, and they're just going to be caught blindsided in a kind of Schumpeterian mode of creative destruction. And I think that's bigger than the fear of missing out in terms of a motivation. When you talk about adaptation, I mean, there's the three ways that companies usually adapt. They're either forced to, it's either accidental, rarely is it deliberate. And I think that, it's getting to the point where there's going to be that forcing function every quarter when the earnings calls come out. I think the financial community is going to insist that these companies start to think about doing things, which is going to cause them to introspect about what their organizational structure is and how that kind of knowledge graph of what people actually do kind of
Yeah.
figures and comes together. And you know, most of the time when you look at what senior managers do, what senior engineers do, and why they're so much more productive is they're not dealing with like recurring events that are stable. They're
I
dealing
know.
with they're dealing with like irregular operations, edge cases, things that don't quite happen right, that where their expertise is brought in to intervene. So senior software engineers can integrate things very quickly. The middle layer that you mentioned in the study, they're probably being overwhelmed with like so much more stuff that they have to go through. Their productivity is going down. But I think how we integrate AI into the workflow of a large organization is something that really hasn't been thought of before. And one of the things that startups have is that alignment of the top team, because everybody's got the same kind of interests at heart. There's a higher order. Everybody's got stock in the company, so it works collectively. You don't have that kind of alignment in C-suites in large organizations. They tend to be very political. And so I think, the problem in large organizations is getting the people that do things aligned with the generals. And I think there's a large layer of administration that historically has been put there. I think
Yeah.
that layer is disappearing now. And that vacuum that's being left is what needs to be filled with a much more practitioner-oriented kind of way of doing things rather than a sort of bureaucracy or administration.
Right, pulling in that direct knowledge. It's an interesting point about not just thinking of the bubble of overexuberance, but almost these fault lines of inertia or fragmentation, right?
Yeah.
We've got a question in the chat that's asking about inventing business workflows or customized agentic AI to enterprise-specific use cases. Would anyone like to tackle that one?
I'm happy to if
Yeah.
it helps. One of the areas where I see a big impact is in regulatory filings. And so companies that have medical devices that are in different countries around the world have to get licenses every year to function. And those areas are really being radically improved with LLMs and just looking at documentation requirements in different countries and getting the necessary paperwork done, things like that. I think there are areas in medical billing where historically there's been problems in getting procedures justified and things like that. That I think is being moved along very rapidly right now. I think the area that's kind of most interesting that I'm seeing is it seems to be working better with like owners of businesses that have
Yeah.
a particular, outcome in mind that they want to work with. And So they work back from the business first. I think in large organizations, big contracts are an area where there's improvement. You know, if you got a $10 million contract, you've probably got 6 or 7 people that have to sign off with a couple of hundred pages of backup material, things like that. I think that's an area where it's been particularly helpful.
I agree with Stuart. Again, it's really about, and again, especially for startups, a business, you know, is not going to buy a promise that incorporates, you know, a reinventing of the business process. They're going to look for efficiencies, and that's going to be measured based on what am I doing right now? What is the cost to Stuart's points? What's the cost right now of managing this $10 million contract versus what could be the cost with a very specific solution that would provide some customized agentic AI for an enterprise use case. That is it. So I would focus on that. And again, it goes back to that kind of 3 tiers that I talked about before. We're moving from personal to a process. Later on, maybe we can reimagine, you know, or reinvent the business workflow. But for startups that need to sell right now, that's what's selling. And that's what, again, and you know, full disclosure, I'm fully biased. This is exactly what we're doing. You know, we're going to companies and saying, how much time and money are you spending on process X right now? And would you like to spend a fraction of that with, you know, a minimal cost? Yes, no. That is it.
Yeah, I think just to add on that point a little bit, I just reading the question a little bit in terms of how can startups gain a moat over larger distributors. I do think startups, they can fall into a number of different categories, whether you're doing B2C or B2B, whether you're building a product or a technology. I do think it's difficult these days to have a technology moat for your startup. It's possible, but it's hard. I do think, going back to what Ian said a few minutes ago, LLMs are fundamentally, you know, by their nature, non-deterministic. If you can pair together a problem that a business has, and you can pair together taking a non-deterministic technology and wrapping it in a deterministic way, and you can stitch these 2 things together, and as Ian said, you can explain why a customer should care about this, why it's going to save them money, why it's going to make them more productive. I think we live in an age where it's very easy to grow very quickly. So I think of it less of a technology mode and more of a product mode.
It's interesting, more on the business side.
Yeah.
I'd love to kind of just contribute my 2 cents here, which is that I think there's kind of 2 paths to wild success, and they're pretty different from each other. One of them is like, what could you not do with AI that you can now do with AI? What was not possible 10 or 20 years ago that is possible today? And not only what's possible today, but what's going to be possible in 5 years, and how can you get ahead of that?
That transformative piece, right?
Totally transformative, right? Just like, you know, this is like a big bang event sort of thing. But that's hard. And the reason it's hard is because you can't grab onto an existing budget line item.
That's
if you want to grab onto your existing budget line item, then what you have to do is you have to define the use case very well and say, this was the old way, and then say, and this is the new way, and then hope that you can get in front of people before whoever it is who can also provide as much value doing it the new way as possible. So that's one way that I see that.
Absolutely. I like that a lot, because I think it also asks organizations as well as you know, inventors and startups to introspect a little bit and know who they are in that spectrum of things, or like what's their strategy around it. One of the things I like to think about or ask startups is, are you guys and girls first movers or best in class? You know, and to kind of know which direction you're going, and are you going to shift at some point? We've got another question in the chat too.
Can I just add something while you're talking? Because the main problem I see happening right now is you have to unbundle your existing SaaS stack to inject whatever, and so it ends up you can't you can't unbundle it totally. You just take that one little slice off. So you're actually paying for two things in parallel.
Yeah.
And that's kind of the problem right now, I see. And then the
Yeah.
platforms that you're using tend to be very adaptive, and they embrace whatever the best of breed was. And it takes them 90 to 120 days. So you're in this sort of
Yeah.
like catch-up mode right now, which is a problem, I think, for many. Sorry, I didn't mean to interrupt the question.
No, I think that was very relevant. And what I'm hearing from startups in different walks is, thinking about, hey, what, unless we're making a big splash somewhere, what are the channel partners and integrations that we can align with and partner with? And to your point about, the ones that will gravitate towards each other, to be part of that platform ecosystem.
Yes,
I
I
think
think
that,
ecosystem is the exact word that we need to think about going forward.
yeah, people are trying to wrangle the complexity, right, around what we have. We've got a second question here in the chat. Where is the biggest bang for the AI buck in vulnerability management? Yes, vulnerability management is a problem that will not go away. So, what do we think the biggest bang for the buck is? Let's do lightning answers and then discuss. So, Carolyn.
Who can get the context and keep it up to date quickly?
Yeah, that one's a hard one. Ian.
Yeah, I 100% agree with Caroline. It's about context. It's about disseminating large amounts of information that's hard for humans to do and shortening that to seconds while providing the human with a very tangible, all right, what's next?
David.
Sorry, I'm going to cheat and give two answers. Apologies. I think one is code review tools. AI code review tools are exceptional. The second thing I'd say in terms of vulnerability management for AI is identity security.
Yeah. Stuart.
There's so much, it's kind of hard. A quick fire answer. I mean, look, vibe coding is being displaced by agentic swarm coding now, which is going to accelerate it even more. I think the best way to do it, we wrote a paper about crisis management. I think you've got to expect that you're going to have troubles. And what you need to do is to think about the different scenarios that you're able to enact quickly once the vulnerability has been pierced, because that's you can't now imagine all of the things that you're vulnerable for. I mean, we shared that paper on MCP security, and there's just, I had no idea rug pulling was like a big deal that came over from crypto and is now in MCP. And I think that there's an inability for most people that aren't in the sort of IT function to understand what these vulnerabilities are. So I think the most important thing is to educate people in the rest of the organization just what needs to be done to try and minimize that. I don't think it's something that can be avoided.
So I have a question, we're seeing a lot of movement in especially in that vuln management space. Everyone doesn't now have like an AI driver or AI spin or taste on it, but using AI for security, but thinking of security for AI, or even just security for AI plus our ecosystem. The context aspects that you all mentioned, as well as I think the identity piece. How hard are we and AI going to have to run to keep up with how much harder the problem has now become?
Take that. I think there's a follow-up question on my end, or on my previous answer of what's next mean. And this is basically it. You've got the context, you've got the IAM, you've got the identity. Now what? That's still the bottleneck, in my opinion. I haven't seen good AI solutions that would provide, that would be trusted to take action. And that's exactly where we're going to fail, because attackers don't care about, failures. They have to succeed once. As defenders, if you didn't take the right action, you failed. So I think that's, just to clarify, that's what I meant. The what's next is the action based on the context, based on the identity that I need to secure right now or modify. And honestly, I would think that is the next step of AI. And I can't remember, I think it was David that mentioned, providing deterministic models to govern and kind of manage those creative ones. That's what I would
That's
like
right.
to see, I think, in terms of decision support mechanisms that would allow us to really catch up with the pace of attackers in the context of vulnerability management, so that once a vulnerability appears, we all know that in this day and age, we've got seconds to remediate it. And if it's not remediated, an attacker is going to use it. So shortening that time to action, of that remediative action that is not going to break my environment, but is deterministically correct for my content.
What you guys are emphasizing here, David and Ian, reminds me of something that a friend, Evan Powell over at Deep Tempo, said, that non-deterministic generative AI has no place in defense at scale, which I thought was a interesting but important point, just setting the line down. In terms of that advantage, attackers versus defenders, what do we think that the current landscape is tilting that towards? I'll start with Stuart.
Unfortunately, I think the lack of knowledge about what's going on gives the advantage of people that have that knowledge, and I think that the people that have that knowledge right now are the attackers and not the defenders. But I think that there'll be enough momentum and shared concern that they'll very quickly become de facto industry standards that people can start to apply, but we're not there yet. And I think that's where the startups, I think, need to come through with like new paradigms of what Ian was saying and what David was saying about identity is key. There are about 20 digital identities to every human right now before you even start to build the agents. So
It's gonna get worse.
who's got credentials, who's got authority, who's, to go to action, spending power, who can spend money and things like that? Do you let the agent, make these things? It's a difficult call. So I think that there's a lag right now, and there always has been in cyber. It's not something which is new, but I think, to David and Ian's point and Caroline's point, the speed is the thing that's changed. So the clock speed of the enterprise has really kind of kicked into a gear, which is almost the same as a startup now. And I think that, you can't deterministically, you can't really you have to think of what you're doing now as a portfolio of actions, some of which are going to work and some of which aren't. And you need the sensing mechanisms to quickly eradicate those that are not working and concentrate and bring in the new options that you need. It's a very dynamic situation right now, and I think the tools that we have in most organizations, there's a lot of legacy that sort of inhibits that speed of action, and I think there's a need for fairly massive spring cleaning going on right now before you can overlay these new components on them.
So if people aren't running and hustling already, they should be, just to make it work.
For sure. It's just block and tackling.
Yeah.
I mean, look, most startups go through like a dozen near-death experiences if they're going to be successful.
Absolutely.
You can't do that in a big company. People don't have they don't have the staying power to withstand that kind of sort of stress and strain.
That's right.
I don't
They're
know.
like, I didn't sign up for this.
But I don't know many happy CIOs right now. They're all walking around with it's a kind of, but and I think we're so early in the game right now. As I think Caroline and Ian, David really mentioned, we're still working these things out, and so there's a need for everybody to share best practices, and one of the things that I see, especially in the Bay Area, there's a willingness to network, to learn from each other, and to very quickly kind of create that sort of response that's needed. And I think the key word at the end of the day is we've really got to be very versatile and moving into different areas very quickly, and not view what we're doing as like a stone corridor. This is what we're always doing.
That's right.
That's the new way of doing things, and I think it requires that decisive leadership to enable people to have the authority to do things in the moment.
Yeah, to be empowered all the way down. So versatility, decisiveness, and collaboration as a survival technique and method, right?
Yes, and I think you need to be very malleable as well. You know, you need to be able to
Yeah.
take input in and change things. And so the shift towards a kind of flexible mindset is really something that startups have always had to do. You know, you go through a round of funding every 18 months and the world changes in between and you've got to adapt as you go along. Whereas most big companies have typically had this sort of 5-year strategy. And, you know, we go through this annual strategic planning kind of circus where you get all the data in June and July, and then September have an offsite, and you decide where you're going to spend the money for the next year. Well,
That's
with
right.
in 90 days, you got to be able to change with it.
Yeah. Caroline, attackers or defenders, advantage?
Hackers. And, you know, the thing is, at the risk of vast oversimplification, I think of cybersecurity controls as basic and fundamental. Like these concepts have been around for 20, 30 years, and we actually just need to do them properly or we're at significant risk. And then there's this whole category of like sophisticated stuff, right? And
Yeah.
so what I think is happening is some of this like basic 101 stuff is shifting underneath our feet, right? So
Yeah.
we tried to get data governance and things like data leakage prevention right 10 or 20 years ago. And then it just kind of got too hard and too boring, but it kind of didn't matter for a while. But now it like really matters.
Yeah.
You know,
Great
we
way to
kind
put
of got phishing and social engineering right for the year 1995, you know, but
Yeah,
but
for a
but it's
moment.
not the year 1995 anymore, you know, and this is still what people are being trained on. I think literally computers are so much better at solving captchas than actual humans are. And so there are these just like fundamental basic 101 things that attackers are like, it's so easy for me to transform this. And then
Yeah.
enterprises are like, oh, it's super hard for me to transform my defense.
Right, any of it. It reminds me of a red teamer I knew who said, like, look, I'm just going to go after the thing you're paying the least attention to. I said, yeah, of course, of course. Ian, attackers or defenders, advantage?
You stole my words again. I've been a red teamer for probably half of my career.
Yeah.
That's easy. The advantage is with attackers, and the reason is, and this is one of my favorite quotes: the biggest obstacle to the next human renaissance is humanity itself. Humans are the weakest link. It's
Yeah.
laid it out precisely. We all know what the basic elements should be. If everyone would do the right thing, basic things. We're not talking about rocket science as far as
Yeah.
cybersecurity goes. Attackers would have a much harder job, and I would be out of a job. My career would be over 15 years ago. So attackers definitely have the advantage. Humans are still the obstacle for, and again, goes back to the previous discussion about making the decision, taking the action, remediating the things. They have the information. AI is distilling it for them. It's automating a lot of processes, and humans are still the obstacle. Whether it's getting kind of the executives to permit independence and action taking from the lower ranks, or from the lower ranks for kind of taking the initiative and saying, I'll pay for this later maybe, but we need to take action right now, and we need to implement something that is not going to take 6 signatures to deploy.
Yeah.
So
we're going to do the painful, inconvenient thing, and we're going to make it easy for people to do that painful, inconvenient thing.
Exactly.
David, attackers or defenders, advantage?
I'd love to be controversial and say defenders, but
right, yeah, we need someone to. But
I think it's very heavily weighted in the attacker's favor. The thing I would say very heavily is it's an economic problem. Attackers fundamentally, they're there to make money, and if they're not successful, they don't make any money. So what AI or LLMs, however you want to phrase it, has just lowered the cost of doing that. The ability to craft a spear phishing campaign, the ability to take a new CV and write an exploit and get it out there is just lower than it's ever been. And so, fundamentally, whether it's Scattered Spider or a North Korean state actor, they're kind of under the same pressures we are, that they have to show results, they have to show money coming back in, and the cost of doing that has just dropped. And for a lot of companies, obviously, defense is incredibly important, security is incredibly important, but it's not how that company makes money primarily for most companies. So the cost of compromise for them is not existential in the same way it is for attackers. The final thing I would say as
So
well is
lagging. It's like a lagging indicator for most companies, right? You know, it's not the first thing they're thinking about.
certainly. I think you see, obviously, over in Europe, GDPR legislation tried to address this, where the fines for GDPR violations can be a percentage of the company's global revenue to try and balance some of that economic imbalance, I think, between attackers and defenders.
That's an interesting approach to it, and I think that you know, it definitely paints a difficult picture of all of our jobs, but also kind of speaks to all of the things that still need to happen, right? So
Yeah.
I'll ask one last question of the panel. Also, like you know, our quick picture of in 10 years, what would you like AI to have done positively for us in security, or even on a wider basis? I'll start with Carolyn there.
I actually feel like maybe this is the thing today. I have not tried it out yet. I really want to wear my Apple EarPods and I want to talk to someone. I understand I actually can't do this in Europe because of some of the regulations, but I want to talk to someone whose native language is a language that I do not understand, and I want us to be able to talk to each other effectively. I'd love
That's
to do that with a
cool.
group of people. And I think like maybe we can start to do that today, but for sure we'll be able to do that in 10 years. And that's really very extraordinary.
Yeah, I love that. I love that. Ian.
I would love to have a kind of a personalized, again, something very close to Caroline, but more on the personal kind of knowledge gap space where, I'm very selfish, so less about talking to people, more about and the AirPods that can understand my context right now and fill me in on any gaps that I have from a knowledge perspective.
Gonna know
That
it
I
all.
should know, something I should know to make a
Yeah.
decision right now. Whether it's negotiating on a used car or making a big financial decision or whatnot. That fully contextual sort of agent in my ear, or even better, because hearing is so slow, straight into my brain.
Uh-huh.
I need that kind of information dump.
Really.
Just I want to know kung fu right now. It's
So the genius super athlete version of oneself in a box.
Yeah, and I don't care if it goes away in a few seconds, but
Yeah.
because I understand capacity is human capacity, brain capacity is a problem, but give it to me for 10 seconds, for a minute, for an
Right.
hour, whatever it is, make it go away afterwards. I don't want to know astrophysics. I just want to look at the stars and point out something very specific at a point in time.
David.
Amazing question. I think I would love to see us get to a point where context windows aren't as much as a problem as they are now.
Yes.
200,000 tokens sounds like a lot, but it soon starts to disappear quite quickly. The viability of LLMs does tend to drop with token size, but I think when we start to get models where the limits are 5 million, 10 million tokens, and you can give it the entirety of a FANG company's code base and ask it to document it, I think that's going to be a very interesting world.
Wow.
So the super capacity to be able to process like what we have.
Yeah.
And last but not least, Stuart.
Do you know, I can't look ahead 10 years. It's too far. I think there's going to be a ChatGPT moment with computer vision coming soon. And where I see things going now is the whole physical AI area is going to take off in a way that we can't even begin to imagine, and create a whole new range of opportunities for different kinds of things. And to Ian's point, I think we're all going to have like a Jeeves that's going to be able to, say, well, I wouldn't say that, sir. You might want to do this, and that kind of pedagogue that leads you to how to learn properly. But I'm in San Francisco and I take Waymos around everywhere. I think that it'd be great having your own Waymo just to get around, and I think that's distinct possibility. But I love Caroline's point about, could humanity talk to each other without this language barrier? I'd love to see us start collaborating with China. We used to do everything
Yeah.
open source, and it used to be shared, and knowledge would grow collectively.
Yeah.
I hope in 10 years that situation comes about.
Yeah, that would do a lot to democratize collaboration and education across the world, really.
Absolutely.
So thank you so much for your very knowledgeable and insightful and just optimistic enough responses. Thank you, Stuart, Carolyn, Ian, and David, for coming in to think about what are we creating now versus what do we want to create for the long term.